Hello, my name is Larissa, and I am a guardian ad litem, volunteer as a guardian ad litem. And today I wanted to reach out to some of you within our community to let you know about a story in reference to a young girl who has played a huge impact on my life and has also silently played a huge impact on many of yours, although you do not know her. So this story started many years ago and was brought to my attention, and this young girl grew up in a average family that many people thought was kind of like the Brady Bunch family. Very great dad, great mom, and what a lot of people didn't know was some of the horrifying events that this child had endured behind closed doors. And when this child was growing up, there wasn't a day that went by that her and her younger sister basically lived in a life of terror. There were so many days that went by where she often wondered, was today going to be the day? Is today the last day she's going to see the light? Is today the day that her dad was basically going to snap and end her life along with her mother and her sister's life? And her story was so impacting that it has caused me to want to reach out and help many other people out there that are in the same situations. When she was very young, she started talking to a counselor in middle school. And when she started talking to this counselor, the way it kind of got brought up was the father had actually showed up to school one day, and he was very upset because she had gotten a C in physical education. And he went in to talk to the counselor about changing her grade from a C to an A, because in his eyes it didn't make sense for anybody to have a C in physical education. So when he went in to talk to the counselor with the child sitting next to him, she sat staring at the ground, not making any sounds, not making any kind of responses. And the father was basically yelling at the teacher. And the teacher was very defensive and could tell that something wasn't right. At the end of the day, he ended up leaving, and the teacher ended up asking the child a very simple question. Are you afraid of your dad? And she looked at her like, I can't believe somebody's even asking me this question right now. And said, yes, I am. She said, yes, I'm afraid of him. And so she actually introduced her to the school counselor. The school counselor started making regular visits with her. She started coming in and sitting down and talking about her life events. Many of those events that were taking place were not being able to sleep at night, the fact that most of the time, she was listening to her mother crying, screaming out in fear, pain, listening to the daily and nightly beatings that her mother was enduring. And even though she didn't feel like anything was going to become above the situation, just the fact that she had somebody to confide in, somebody just to sit there and listen to what was going on, was a huge relief, because the burden that she carried was very, very heavy at a very, very young age. And through the conversations with the counselor, there were several incidents that were involving very life-threatening situations where the father would sometimes hold a gun to the child's head. The father would strangle the child, or sometimes beatings would be so severe that she couldn't sit down for several days. She would wake up the next morning soaked in her own blood from lacerations and cuts from a leather belt. And so one day she gets a surprise, and the counselor calls her up, and she introduces her to a social worker. And we automatically view somebody like a social worker, a teacher, a police officer as a safe person to confide in and to talk to. And so she started opening and bleeding her heart out to the social worker, because the social worker was like, I'm a safe person to talk to. Tell me everything, and I promise you nothing will go outside of this room. And at the end of the day, when she got done telling the social worker everything that was transpiring and taking place, she left thinking, maybe tomorrow's going to be different. Maybe tomorrow I get to wake up feeling safe, because safe just didn't exist in her environment. There was never a moment where she ever felt safe. She was always on the edge, always in what we would call survival mode. It never ended. And several weeks had gone by, and she had actually forgot what was about the conversation with the social worker. And then one day she's sitting outside and she's having lunch with some friends, and all of a sudden she gets a glimpse, and her father's walking towards her in a very abrupt manner. And right off the bat she knew something wasn't right. Something didn't feel right. And he points to her and he tells her, get up, we need to go. And so she gets checked out of the school. And they get in the car, and he gets around the corner from the school. The moment he gets around the corner from the school, he pulls the car off to the side, pulls out a weapon, pulls out a gun, points it to the side of the child, grabs a seatbelt, wraps it around her neck, pulls so tight that she literally could feel kind of like a snake squeezing. Like every time she'd take a breath, the air was just kind of going. And it was almost to the point where she was losing consciousness. And out of the corner of her ear, the one thing that stood out, the one thing that she could hear, was he was whispering, and he said, if you do not lie to the social worker, if you don't tell her that you made all of this up, I promise you, then you're going to be standing in front of your mother and your sister, and you're going to watch them die a very slow death. And I can't even imagine for many others out there that have ever lived in an environment where something like that ever comes across, where fear just takes over a person. There's so many people out there, and I just want to say this, that say, well, it's really easy just to tell somebody what happened, or to walk away from a domestic violence situation. When somebody is raised and corrupted with fear, it is very difficult to walk away from something, because the fear of unknown, that this person could actually follow through with what they're saying, is very scary. And when you're 12 and 13 years old, and all you have is your mother and your sister, the last thing you want to do is put their lives in danger and have something bad happen to them. So my understanding was that when all said and done and they went back to the house, the social worker shows back up, and she sits in front of the social worker, who is actually being interviewed along with her parents next to her. And what's funny is she kind of had a game plan in her head. She always had a game plan, always tried to be one step ahead. Well, if he does this, I'll do this. And so her game plan was, well, I'll just talk to the social worker in a private setting when she interviews me and tell her what just happened. But that never happened, because when she was interviewed with the social worker, they were interviewed all together in a group. And because they were interviewed all together in a group, and her father sat right in front of her the whole entire time, her natural reaction was to do what he said. And when he said to lie, that's what she told the social worker. She said, I'm sorry, I made all of this up for attention, and none of this had happened. And even though she was asked multiple times by the social worker if she was lying, then she still kept saying, yes, I was lying, and none of this had really happened. After the social worker had left, there was some very severe consequences, and those consequences ended up being about 45 lashes with a leather belt. and they were so severe she ended up passing out halfway through them and waking up the next morning full of cuts and bruises. And that's just honestly just one incident of 100 that I could tell you that had happened. So as time kind of went by, you know, she had given up on trusting anybody and telling anybody what was happening. And everything that was corresponding at home was just kind of building up and building up. What's funny is a lot of people, they look for obvious signs of abuse, and they look for the markings on the face. They look for a child that's dirty and in dirty clothes. And for this child, she was always clean. She never had the visible markings on the outside, but the markings were all covered up on the inside. And there was a lot of emotional damage as well as sexual abuse that went on in the home as well. And when this child became high school and started moving on into high school, the mother had finally made a decision to run off and hide, basically. And that was a very exciting day. And what she ended up doing was packing up the two kids and and all the articles of what they could carry in one car, and moved into a new apartment. And life was great for about 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, all of a sudden, her dad shows back up at this new apartment. And the mom says, well, I felt like I needed to give him another opportunity. I felt like I didn't give him enough of a chance to prove that he could be a good father or a good husband. And so, and that he offered to get counseling was the other excuse. And after about a month of all of this, he went right back to his old ways, and the physical violence ended up becoming more, the sexual abuse becoming more, the emotional damage, the verbal abuse. The final countdown of everything was when she came home the end of her freshman year from a group outing, and the door was half cracked open into the apartment. And she didn't think much of it, because she pushed the door open, walked inside the apartment complex, and her dad was actually hiding behind the door. And he ended up grabbing her from behind and pointing a gun to her head and was threatening her, wanting to know where her mother and her sister were. But she had no clue. She had just got back from, a high school event. She had no idea where they were. And although she kept saying, I have no idea, he was very persistent that she did know. And after a good 20-30 minutes of him sitting there torturing and taunting her over and over again, the mother and the sister walk in the front door. And that moment, she gets up and she runs and she grabs her sister, who's about 6 years old, grabs the sister and runs back into the bedroom. When she runs back into the bedroom, she closes the door. Now again, many people would be like, well, why didn't she run out the door? Well, again, fear is, it's very powerful to a child. When that child has that fear of not knowing what's going to happen, they're too afraid to do anything but stay where they're at. Because although the situation is dangerous, it's safe. And I know that sounds crazy, but it really is. And one of the other things, through that night, it was literally quiet. There was nothing but silence. And I can't tell you from an outsider's opinion looking in how crazy it is, how silence is scary. Because when you are brought up in a domestic violence, when you are being brought up being physically abused, not hearing the screams, not hearing the yells, not hearing the cries for help, that becomes scary because you don't know what's going on. And you don't know if that person is alive or dead. So you hope that the next morning you wake up and everybody's still breathing and moving. So when she woke up the next morning, everything seems normal, as always. The father was at work, the mother was at work. She took her sister and dropped her off at school, and she went to school. Later that afternoon, the mother shows up at her school, and she said, "I don't want you to come home." She said, "Go stay at your friend Tracy's house." She said, "Because your father's been arrested." And you know, those words were very hard to hear, because it brings a almost like a peace, a sense of peace, knowing that you can go home and there's nobody there that's going to hurt you. And what I want, and I guess if you haven't figured out by now, the story that I'm actually talking and sharing with you is a story of my own personal life. So this was my upbringing, and this is the day-to-day terror that I dealt with for 16, 17 years. And after my father went to prison, you know, that became a healing process for myself and for my sister and for my mother. And we had actually started the whole process of going through the courts. And because I had been felt burnt or hurt so far down the line for as many people that I had reached out to and tried to get help, and nobody wanted to listen, nobody wanted to believe a child. It was almost kind of like somebody always thought I was making these things up to tell a story, to get attention. And so when we went to go meet with the state attorney's office to sit down to talk about the events that had happened, I sat in this very large room at the age of 16 now. And you know, the gentleman walks in and he introduces himself as a state attorney. And he starts asking me all these questions. And in the back of my mind, I was just like, I am not saying a word, because I was afraid that if I said something, it was going to come back and have repercussions of something bad. So I really sat there and just kind of stared at the ground and didn't say anything. And after 15 minutes, when he kept trying to get something out of me, he left, and he actually walked out of the room. And I thought, oh great, I am in so much trouble. And he comes back in with a very young lady, and she had like the biggest smile on her face, and almost like a calming to her. And she came over and she sat down and she introduced herself. She said, "Hi Larissa," she said, "my name is Cheryl," and she said, "I'm a guardian ad litem." And I have never heard of those words, didn't know what a guardian ad litem was. And she started explaining what her role was. And this was the first time through my traumatizing childhood that I started to build a relationship with somebody that I could trust. And the great thing that I liked about it, the thing that was good for me, was I had this person that I could finally talk to, that could advocate for what was going on in my home. And she was willing to listen. Most people didn't want to listen. And then she took what I said and she went to court for me. The biggest fear I had as a child was having to stand up in a courtroom talking to all these people with my abuser sitting across the way from me staring at me. That gave me so much anxiety. And the fact that I didn't have to do that with her there. She was there to speak on my behalf in court and tell my story to the judge, and how I felt and what I felt my father's punishment should have been. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I circled back around many years later to do what I'm doing now, is because our community is really suffering. We have so many kids in our society that need help. They need an adult. They need somebody to advocate, somebody who is strong-willed and willing to sit and listen. That's all they want, is somebody to listen. To let them tell you the story of what's going on at home. Take what they're saying and go out there and apply it. Be the voice that they need. They need these. And that's one thing our program is missing so much, is we're missing people to be that voice. So many people do not realize how many kids walk by them on a regular day-to-day basis. And these kids are enduring a lot of trauma behind closed doors. It's almost like we hear an old motto that Don't judge a book by its cover. It's very easy to grab a book, pick it up, look at it. It's blank, there's no illustrations, there's no colors, so what do? We push it off to the side and we go for something that's more attractive. Well, kids in our society are the same way. These kids don't have the obvious signs of abuse. And so what I'm asking, and the reason why I want to share my story, is for two reasons. One is I want to impact our community to get more people out there to be that voice, to come and volunteer. And some people probably say, well, I don't have the time for it. Well, you know what? I don't have the time for it. I'm a mom of 3 teenage boys, and I am running 100 miles an hour 24/7. But I make the time because your children are my children. And if we don't have somebody like myself or somebody like yourself out there impacting and helping these kids, then who is? Nobody. And then we end up with stories on the TV with children that have died at the hands of their parents or their guardians. So what I want for everybody to do is to take the time and look up the Litem Program and see how you can make an impact on helping the kids that are in our society, because the last thing we need is to pass one more child up.